Hello.
Hello, all. We'll drink some tea together.
Yeah. So
Brewing.
today we're going to start brewing some tea. I'll tilt the camera down so you can see. We have a slightly different setup than usual with a larger pot and a cloth tea bag for that larger pot.
Yeah.
And today we're brewing our Assam Sessa that we sent out for our July tea. And I'm going to talk about tea brewing.
Yeah. Kind of an overview of tea brewing and kind of what practices we find or end up doing and why or how we ended up where we are as far as tea brewing. We were lucky enough to get some questions emailed to us, so we're going to definitely hit on those and sure to hit on more as they come up and just talk general brewing methods and methodology. Before we get into that too much, you want to talk about this tea in particular, Jace?
Yeah, so I thought that an Assam would be a really good tea to pair with the talk of tea brewing because Assam is one of the many teas that goes well with a variety of styles of brewing. So you can combine this with milk and sugar if you want a more English style of tea, or you can brew it gong fu, or you can do a larger pot and still drink it straight. And it really does go well with a variety of steeping times, anywhere from 45 seconds to like maybe 2 minutes with this tea you could do. And that's also dependent on the amount of leaf in proportion to the amount of water that you're using, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. But Assams generally hold up really well to a wide range of brewing styles. And what's really interesting in particular is because Assams have this ability, they also tend to be bases for a lot of Western style tea blends like English breakfast, Irish breakfast. I think there's an Assam and Russian caravan.
Now, it's also worth noting that when we're saying Assam in this instance, we are talking about a region and a style of Camellia sinensis plant varietal Assamica.
Yeah. So within Assam, there's a huge variety because Assams are made from the other varietal of tea. The one that we've mostly been drinking so far in the subscription is Camellia sinensis varietal sinensis, which is known as the Chinese leaf, and Assam is known as the Indian leaf, and that's kind of loosely based off of where they were originally found to natively grow. Though sinensis, bar sinensis, it's kind of on the border of China and South Asian countries, whereas Assam was found originally in India in the Assam Valley, which is why it's called Assam. So you'll find a lot of Indian teas made with Assam and sinensis because of the British colonizing and destroying native things. But a lot has come from both of them, which is really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's a lot of variety within Assam teas and tea styles. And today we're drinking a really delicious one, I think.
Yeah. I'm a fan of it.
Yeah. So if you didn't catch it lower on the screen about a minute ago, Tim took out our tea bag and we now have tea stored, brewed in the teapot, and we're pouring into the sharing pot. I honestly don't know why I put the sharing pot here.
I'll help you. One of the reasons is so that we can actually really look at the liquor color and share that with you better than trying to tilt over our cups and
it is a very beautiful liqueur today.
Yeah, and also that gets into one of our first kind of methodologies of brewing, which is why I think it's important to brew with a pitcher prior to a cup. And that's because it's your first evaluation. You're able to really look at the tea, and if it's one that you've worked with before, you might be able to gain information from it before you drink it. of if it looks a little thin or hasn't picked up as much color as you usually are used to, you can get it back in with the leaf and get it steeping a bit longer if you feel that's necessary. So for me, that's one of the reasons. Also, I really like the bulbous shape that comes up to kind of a bit more of a point, because then you're able to really get the aroma kind of focused up. Whereas in a cup, as great as they are, that aroma kind of leaches out. And when you're brewing and when you're really brewing tea and trying to figure out how you want to brew your tea, it really is a full sensory experience. Feel the pot. How does your teapot hold on to the heat? How does the tea smell? Of course, taste. How does it look? Does it look thin? Does it look viscousy? Kind of helps you pinpoint the things that you want or don't want over time. Annoyingly, most of the information that we're going to be sharing about kind of tea brewing and tea methodology and kind of our approach to it is evidence-based, but it is subjective evidence-based. So it's our experiences and our experiments that we've done side by side and decided this way works better.
And also heavily research based on looking at how other people have brewed tea, and like there's kind of a general consensus among tea brewing of like general guides, but everyone has their own distinctive style and taste.
Yeah. And so with that, we'll get into one of the first questions that we got in that email that we mentioned. The writer is asking, for teas that have a lot of tannins, one of those chemicals that exist in teas, also in red wines, such as black tea, steeping too long will make the tea bitter. What about green tea and oolongs? What happens if they're steeped too long? So from research that I have come across, tannins exist in almost all the teas, just in varying amounts. And from my experience, I find that oversteeping any tea will release more of those tannins and get more of those bitter notes. Bitter notes aren't bad. They just are. They might overshadow other notes that you want more. Or you might want like a very rich kind of bitter, unctuous brew of tea. So that's...
Yeah, I think another way to approach this question is kind of thinking about what happens between overbrewing teas that have a lot of tannins versus overbrewing teas that don't have a lot of tannins, and specifically like what is the end result of those two things. Because what I've noticed is that teas with a lot of tannins, so a lot of black teas, dark oolongs, pu'er, when they're overbrewed, they get bitter. Whereas teas with a lot of or less tannins, so greens, light oolong, some sheng pu'er, they get astringent, which is kind of like bitter, but it's a sharpness that bitter doesn't necessarily have. And like it still can get bitter, and the teas that tend to get bitter can also get astringent. But I think there's kind of a difference.
There's
between the two.
It's kind of different sides of the same knife point there. I feel like that there's the astringency and there's a bitterness, and very often they can get perceived as the same thing. But so like bitterness for me, I feel it kind of on my upper gums, like right in the front of my mouth. It's that like kind of suck on your face feeling. Whereas for the sharpness is a back of the mouth feel for myself. generally speaking, like a tea that's sharper tends to hit farther back.
It's interesting. I perceive it a little bit different, where more bitter teas kind of sit really heavy on the middle of the tongue, and more astringent teas kind of pull at both ends of the tongue.
Yeah.
So it's a longer versus a shorter.
Yeah.
Different perspectives.
Yeah. Let us know how you seem to perceive sharpness versus bitterness, or if you feel there's a separation there. Can be different for different folks. Someone's asking about for teas with compressed leaves, such as cakes or needles, can you either do a hot rinse or do the first steep longer to allow the leaves to open? I'm a fan of the rinse all the time. Mostly that comes to a fact of I have too much tea that sits around for too long before I drink it, so it gets kind of like tea dusty, and I want to get rid of that and allow that tea to kind of be there as what it is going to be. Kind of that first rinse, so that is taking hot water, introducing it with the leaves in the vessels that you're going to be consuming it in. It also gives the ability to warm up your vessel prior to actually drinking, which is always a thing that I'm a fan of, because you can really change the temperature of the water you're brewing with by introducing it to the leaf in a cold vessel. Thinking especially here in Vermont in winter, trying to brew at 90 degrees in winter in a house that we generally keep around 68, 70, can get you a drink that isn't as warm as you want it to be.
Yeah, it kind of shocks the vessel when the ambient temperature is low. And with everything being shocked, it kind of just doesn't quite open up and doesn't quite get as warm.
Muddles flavors.
Yeah. I'm kind of the opposite of Tim, and that's purely because of how I function with drinking tea. Often I don't just sit with tea. I'm doing things while I'm drinking tea, which is something that I'm trying to adjust. So I sit with tea by itself a little bit more, but often I don't rinse because I purely forget to. And I remember by the time I've poured leaf in, I'm like, okay, I'm too impatient. I will do a longer first steep than maybe this tea wants, to kind of combine the rinse with the steep. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit for those who may not know. Rinsing leaf is important for compressed leaf, so tightly rolled oolong tea that comes in compressed cake forms and whatnot, because it allows the tea leaf to open up more and release all of its flavors and tannins and whatnot.
Yeah.
Most teas that are not compressed or tightly rolled don't necessarily need that. Some of them enjoy it. It very much varies tea to tea.
It's not a bad practice to be in.
Yeah. Like I wouldn't suggest it for a lot of green teas, particularly Japanese green teas. But many Chinese green or Chinese greens, Chinese anythings will do well with a quick rinse. And the time of the rinse kind of depends on the kind of tea and what the tea wants.
And also, moreover, if in any steeping you're feeling like your leaf isn't opening up and you're not getting kind of all of the leaf exposed to the water, then let it hang out longer, let it open up more.
Don't be afraid to pour your water back into your teacup or teapot.
Blooming teas, I can't really speak to because I don't engage with them.
So blooming teas are kind of a whole thing onto themselves, because it's not a natural shape for the tea leaf. It's a man-made bloom. So it's not a flower that you're drinking, it's tea leaf that's been tied together in a way that'll open up differently than it naturally would. And often you will see blooming teas in these beautiful glass teapots that have a lot of water in them, and you leave them steeping for a long time. Usually that's okay. Most blooming teas are made with the intention of long steeps.
Yeah, so they're using a different kind of leaf, using different herbs or flowers potentially in some of those. And
yeah, so I would not
spectacle.
I would not rinse a blooming tea because the whole purpose of the bloom is to add to the visual of the tea. So if you rinse it before you steep it, then you don't really get the big show that it's intended for.
Someone's asking from that email, for all teas, does adding to the amount of leaves for the brew always increase the flavor in a positive way, or are there negative to too many leaves? Yes, I find that there is negative to too much leaf. That really being defined by the size of your vessel, and that's going back to the extraction of the chemicals, the flavor compounds in the leaves. That I find generally, if you get so much leaf in there that you're not able to get an even extraction, so you'll have pockets of leaf that are really, really able to unfurl and get full exposure, and through that, their flavor compounds leach out, and other pockets where they're more tied up against a wall, or they're just not able to get that full circulation of water. I have found that, generally speaking, there is a right and a wrong amount of leaf for my sense of flavor and what I like in my cups. I don't know if there's like a hard and fast rule of like always this ratio to this ratio of leaf to water, but there is a good guideline.
Like I, for the most part, agree with Tim, though I think it's also a very subjective thing of, like, first when you start out with what is your goal? Is your goal to brew tea to sit with and enjoy? Then yes, there is going to be a line of too much leaf to water ratio. Is your goal to get a tea concentrate? Because then you'll want a lot of leaf compared to water, because you don't want to over steep a concentrate, because you can't cover up bitterness or astringency once it's there.
You can't remove those sharper notes.
Yeah, like adding more water after the fact will do nothing for that. Or are you doing, I'm forgetting the phrase, a flash brew, where your goal is to get a cold tea, but you don't have enough time for a cold brew, so you hot brew it and then pour it over ice, then you'll probably want some more leaf. So it's all kind of like, it's based off of what your goal is in the end. If you're strictly just drinking tea in a more meditative sense that is kind of like an everyday drinking, there's going to be a line.
I suppose that's one of the things that we should get right out in front of here, which is my relation to tea and tea drinking is 100% a meditative practice that so happens to be really tasty. Chase's relationship to tea is closer to tasty beverage.
I like to experiment with my tea, so like I'll do like funky things when I'm brewing on my own that Tim like absolutely hates sometimes. And then I make him try it, and he like kind of okay,
That's a choice.
Yeah, like it's not a wrong choice that I ever make. It's sometimes like a weird choice, but I always think it's good, or figure out how I would do it different later. So like we have two very different perspectives on this topic of brewing mechanics.
Yeah. That being said, we both come with some of the same nuts and bolts.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the same kit that we're starting with. We're just building different things from them.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the goal of this, is saying, here's a toolkit for how to engage with tea brewing. Figure out what you're building with it.
Yeah. I just realized that we kind of flipped perspectives from where we started, each of us, because you started drinking tea with your grandmother, who had like amazing fine Chinese teas and brewed it in an English style.
Very English.
And I started with Japanese tea ceremony, basically.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
We have a question from the chat. Within the range of not overcrowding the leaf, 1 gram versus 2 gram, is the higher amount always better? Depends on the vessel.
Yeah, vessel and leaf. So why I say leaf is I'm going to search through here and grab some different leaf options to kind of show you what I mean by that. And Chase, I'll hand them 2 different vessels and size, where they can kind of explain.
Yeah. So here's one Gaiwan that I use very frequently in our home brewing. And here's another. They're like 2 very beautiful Gaiwan, very different sizes. So they will hold very different amount of leaf. I will always put a little bit more in here, and I'll always put a little bit less in this one. And that's because you want to always, when you're brewing with Gaiwan or a vessel that is not needing the addition of a tea bag, you want to make sure that the leaf can fully open throughout the brewing process. So it doesn't have to fully open during the first steep, but by the end of all of the steepings, you want the leaf to be fully open. And that allows the flavor to withstand a fair number of brewing or steepings. And so what Tim's going to get into is how different leaf shapes expand during the brewing process, and why different size vessels can be more ideal for different size leaf.
Yeah, and with that moreover is kind of my quick guideline of when is 1 gram better than 2 grams of leaf for starting off with. And I'm going to use 2 different oolongs as the reasons. So why I'm using oolongs is because they tend to come in a wide variety of leaf shape. And so that is either rolled into kind of a ball or twisted into more of a twig, kind of. Well, yeah, but this also helps. So as Jace pointed out, this is also a rolled one, which is kind of annoying. Figure out how cameras work. So what we've got is, if you're able to see that, it's pretty fine, twisted into little strands. And with a tea like this, because of its overall shape and size, I would use a higher amount of leaf to the same amount of water. Whereas for here, I've got a more kind of full-on rolled type ball of a Lichon, a Taiwanese oolong. And what I'll do real quick is I'll get some water and brew these up, and you'll kind of see what I'm trying to get at, which is a guideline that I use is you'll use 1 to 2 grams of leaf per 150 milliliters of water. and what is a more poetic than it needs to be thought for brewing is when you put your leaf in your vessel, you kind of want it to look like a fall forest floor. So you want enough leaves on the ground where you know what weather is happening and that you're changing seasons, but you still want to see through and see the forest floor. The rationale there is there's then enough space and shape for that tea to fully open up. So generally speaking, a ball-shaped rolled oolong will be a larger and wider leaf than a twisted oolong. And that goes over to most teas beyond oolongs and just general shape of the dried leaf. That generally speaking, a twisted leaf will be thinner and longer, and a rolled leaf will be broader overall. So we'll let these kind of sit to the side and revisit them here in a little bit.
Yeah. But like, also keep in mind that our brewing style for most teas is kind of on the low end of leaf to water proportions. Many people brew with 3 to 4 grams compared to our 1 to 2. So it's also still going to be a matter of preference.
Yeah.
You know, a 1 gram difference can be a lot or can be a little. And that depends on what you like, what your goal is, what the tea does while it's brewing.
Yeah, there are also definitely some teas that I will start with 2 to 3 grams of versus 1 to 2. Mm-hmm. And I very often don't bother weighing my leaf. I do just look at the size of my vessel. That is the brewing vessel, not my drinking vessel. And I, again, generally always speaking, do tea in 3 parts. Mm-hmm. So brewing vessel, transitional vessel, final vessel, drinking vessel. And so if I've got a big old pot like this, I'm going to use a lot more leaf than I would if I'm brewing in a relatively similar shaped pot. But smaller size.
For reference.
Yeah. And
yeah. So I, for today's brew, completely eyeballed it. I knew that this was going to be our vessel and that I wanted to brew in this tea bag. And it's really nice to have a tea scoop when you're brewing. I did about 1.5 of this scoop. Each scoop kind of will hold a different amount of leaf. But this is 1 steep in, but 1.5 scoops is about this much tea in this pot. So you want to have that kind of amount of proportion-ish. Yeah. You know, it's a visual subjective kind of thing that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So while we wait for those leaves to open up a little bit more, we'll talk about another question that was asked, and then we'll come back.
Are there some general guidelines as to what happens to the taste of different styles of teas in regards to steeping temperature? Example, higher temps affect teas in such and such a way, or lower temps tend to bring out these other notes. Mm-hmm. In my experience, cooler water will bring out sweeter notes than hotter water. Where I find this particularly forward is while brewing Japanese green teas. And some of that might be just from Japanese green tea's proclivity to getting scorched. So that is using slightly too high temperature water or brewing for slightly too long, that you get a lot of very harsh flavor compounds in that initial brew and can never recover from it. Whereas for some teas, you're able to kind of overbrew that first time and gain back benefits over subsequent brews.
Yeah.
In my experience, Japanese green teas especially tend to let you know what they're going to give you right up front. And if you miss that memo up front, you're not going to get it back.
One thing to keep in mind with this kind of question is that a tea is always going to taste like itself. So you won't necessarily change the flavor of it with a different temperature of water.
Yeah.
What changes the flavor through the temperature of water is how fast the chemicals are seeped out of the leaf into the water. So a lower temperature water will always be a slower acting steep than a higher temperature water. And so that kind of correlates with different flavor notes of like, if there's going to be less chemical in the water, then it's going to be a lighter, sweeter palate than more chemical, which will tend to be more bitter or astringent or intense.
Get out some of those longer notes.
Yeah. And like the notes will change depending on water temperature and time, where like you might get notes of caramel in a lower temperature and you might get notes of nut in a higher temperature, but they'll still always be there. It's just kind of the proportions of everything as the chemicals are seeped out. How are our leaves doing?
They're coming right along. So we'll take a look in here in this brew. So this is that more twisted tea. And as you see, they're kind of slowly opening up, but we still got a lot of room in this cup. My other cup is same volume. And we started with the same volume of leaf, but we've got more leaf than water now. And if we let this keep going, those leaves will continue to hydrate and get even larger and unfurl more. Already, as you can see, we're looking at this really opening up. And as far as brew wise, I edge towards trying to make sure that your vessel doesn't become overcrowded. So that way you can get that quality infusion that you're able to regulate and repeat. An overbrewed or an overfilled vessel, you can get leaves stuck in the spout area around the filter inside of the pot and get really gummed up and icky. And then again, while you're pouring, you're over exposing those leaves to that water.
Yeah, so basically too much leaf will result in inconsistent steeping of the overall leaf.
Yeah.
And that is not good. It kind of taints the flavor and makes it not always enjoyable.
Yeah, and it makes it hard to continue to regulate and kind of manage your cup. Now, this is getting to a really great point back from our email, which are there general guidelines as to ratio of leaf to water, regardless of, for the amount of water, is there a general rule about keeping a constant ratio of leaves versus waters, regardless of water amount, as long as the leaves are free to easily float in the water, or as the water volume goes up, does the water/ratio change, water tea ratio change.
Mhm.
So
yeah, we were kind of talking about that from the opposite
we
perspective.
were talking around that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in general, if you're increasing the amount of water, I would also increase the amount of leaf.
Yeah. The ratio itself doesn't change.
Mhm.
Their proportions just scale up. So
Yeah.
if we start at 1 part leaf to 3 part water, if we now have 6 part water, we'll now get 2 part leaf.
Mhm.
So it's just keeping that going.
Question from the chat. So if 1 gram of leaf per 150 milliliters water also means 2 grams per 300 milliliters. Yes.
Yep.
So you just always want to scale in the same direction.
Yeah. And if you're finding that and that's mostly to continue to get the same amount of flavor out each time. So for me, it's a consistency thing of if I use 1 gram to 300 milliliters of water, I'll get a beverage that I know, and I've got that. But if I try brewing that same 1 gram with now 600 milliliters of water, it's gonna feel thinner. Those notes in there are going to be thinner. And really, it's less a consistency of direct flavor as much as flavor perception, or like total dissolved solids.
Yeah. And so what also we need to state is that this changes based off of what your goal is. Again, are you trying to brew the same experience but with more or less outcome? Then yes, always scale it in the same way, same direction. Are you trying to see how the tea flavor changes with more leaf to water or less leaf to water, and see if you like it one way or another? Then do that. Like, we're not saying you can't experiment with these ratios. Please do. Please find how you enjoy your tea. But once you find where you enjoy your tea, stick around that ratio, because then you'll always get what you enjoy. And so this is a similar but different conversation than what we had earlier, I think last month or the month before, about steep times and temperatures. Of if you know what you like but want to brew different, change one in one direction and the other in the other direction. It's the opposite with water and leaf ratio, where they want to always be together for the same drink. Experiment, change all the factors, figure out how you want to have your tea.
Yeah.
But it's going to stay the same once you get there.
And again, like how we're arriving at the answers that we're coming up with is subjective evidence-based. This
is what we've experienced.
Have done this. This is what we find. This is what we've tried experimenting with, what we've tried working with, what we found does or doesn't work for us enough where that's at. There's a reason why the Chinese study of tea brewing and making is called Gong Fu Cha. Gong Fu, translation wise, means mastery of, or skill of, or practice of. So it's the skill, the practice, the mastery of tea. And it really is just that over and over again. Is just keep figuring out what works. And that's, I don't know how to encapsulate it really, other than like when when you're getting into tea and really getting into tea brewing, it can get obsessive, and folks will tell you what's right or wrong, a lot. But ultimately, the way that you are doing it is correct.
Mm-hmm.
If you're enjoying what's happening, if you're making a beverage that you enjoy and that you want to share with people, then you're doing it well.
Yeah. This, particularly from the Chinese and Japanese perspective of tea brewing, is why tea brewing and tea drinking goes really well with a meditative practice, because that's kind of what happens during many forms of meditation, of repeating the same thing over and over again and growing from that repetition. So if you're applying meditation to tea brewing, you have 4 elements that you're working with. You have the leaf, the water, heat source, and time. And every time you sit with tea, one of those things, at the very least, is going to change. And so if you put all of your energy into the tea brewing and all of your focus there and notice the changes, then you will be practicing it in a meditative way. And that's like why it's such a subjective experience, because of the noticing of the different changes and how everything affects everything else.
Yeah. I mean, is it possible to brew a bad cup of tea?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for that, it's possible to brew or to have a bad cup of tea solely based on the intention behind it. If someone brews a tea to the best of their ability and with all their focus, and they dump a ton of sugar and milk in it, and they hand it to me, they go, here, I will always say thank you and drink it up and enjoy it, because what I'm enjoying is tea as a space and as a community, not just as a beverage. Mm-hmm. It is about the reciprocation of the experience. And now we are getting into metaphysical conversations about tea, because I worked for a bunch today and drank a bunch of tea, so I'm a little tea drunk already. Mm-hmm. And now we're drinking more tea.
Yeah. Does anyone in the chat have thoughts or questions about anything that we've talked about today? Tea that you're currently drinking, whether it's the Assam that we have for this month or any other tea that you have. This conversation is largely about brewing and not about specific tea. So here, as well as every other chat that we have, you can ask about something that we haven't talked about.
Yeah. We'll do, to the best of our ability, talked about with you and for you. And as always, this is a highlight of the month, being able to sit down and talk about tea. Mm-hmm. It's always great to be able to do it. As we're getting ready to get into, this August. Is July, August, that's how calendars work. Mm-hmm. We're looking forward to being able to share with y'all next month's tea, which I believe we have settled on a Taiwanese oolong, Li Shan. Li Shan, translation-wise, Pear Mountain, and very fun Taiwanese tea. And we're going to get into some conversations about elevation, and what elevation has to do with tea growth and tea consumption, and how there's whole tea culture based around the pursuit of high mountain teas or Gaoshan tea.
Question in the chat. We've had different lapsings that taste very different from each other. Is it different wood used in the smoking of the leaves? Probably.
Likely yes. So they're Lapsang, for folks who aren't aware of it, is a really tasty Chinese black tea that is traditionally smoked. So not smoked as in you inhale it, but during its process of drying out and withering, it is smoked over pine. And those pine notes get into that tea and add this really smoky, almost leathery aroma and taste to the leaves. And what's being asked is if different smoke can affect the final end product of the tea, and the answer is yes. I don't know exactly what smoke will impart what flavors. I haven't done much hunting into that. But then you also get into where that leaf was growing to begin with will affect the leaf. And it does get smoked finally. So you could have the same space smoking the same leaves or smoking different leaves and have them taste very differently because of their terroir that they were growing in.
Yeah, and it's the same for every other tea. If a tea is produced by two different farmers, then you'll have two different teas. And if they're supposed to be the same tea, then they will taste similarly enough to each other to be called the same thing. But that's why, or one of the reasons why you get variation in the same amount or same type of tea.
Yeah, same
different
type of tea, same
producers,
brewing style.
Yeah, it's any factor will change the flavor of the leaf from when and where it's planted, when it's harvested, how it's produced, what techniques are used during production, where it's produced, to how you're brewing, and how old is it? How old is it before it's harvested? How old is it before you brew it? There's so many different factors.
How was the tea stored?
Yeah. Anything will change the flavor of the tea. So it's hard to answer that very specific question because we don't know every single detail about the two teas that you're referencing.
Yeah. Or more than two. I've definitely had some Lapsangs that have kind of a tarry taste to them, as well as ones that are more caramely and more rich. And that has been and has also not been reflective in their price points. So I've had ones that I'm like, it's really tarry and kind of fake tasting that have been very expensive consumer side, as well as ones that are more rich and subtle and what I perceive as a higher quality experience for a much lower price point. So there's something there. I don't know what that is, but it is worth noting that if you find a style of Lapsang, in this instance, that you're consistently getting the flavors that you want from it. As I've said before, buy a bunch of it, and then you have it, and then you don't have to go looking for it again.
This is very much why I like to relate tea to wine, because in our North American perspective, we have this understanding that a wine will change year to year. After every production. There will be something different. And it's the same with tea. Every batch of tea will be different. And so if you approach tea from that understanding, you won't be disappointed. You'll just be like, oh, this is how it's changed this time. And you get to explore the tea in a new way.
We'll do one last kind of look at our brewed up leaves here. So again, this is that twisted one. Still same volume of leaf that we started with. Now that it's absorbed more water,
Still very small.
Still staying pretty small and tight, and hanging out. Whereas by comparison, the more full, tighter rolled, ball-shaped oolong has really opened up and has much broader stem and leaf. Here I'm able to get some out a little better. You'll see this is just one kind of 2-minute brew hanging out. And volumetrically, we started with the same volume of leaf.
And same volume of water.
Same volume of water.
Same steep time.
Same everything. We just got.
Yeah, so the two different shapes, or all the different shapes, because there's more than two across tea.
Yeah.
But the shape of your tea will affect the way that it opens up.
Yeah. And from that, it will affect how much dried leaf you want to start with for your vessel.
Yeah, because the goal is always to get the leaf fully open. So do you have an idea of if this style of shape will open fast or slow, then you'll want to adjust to less or more.
Yeah. Well, I think that covers some pretty good ground for us today in this chat. Like I said, again, always wonderful to be able to have these chief chats. Yeah. And as always, keep getting questions emailed to us in the chat and what have you, and we'll get to them as we can.
Yeah. One final question from the chat. In the case of the first tea, so the tea that didn't open up all the way, how do you get the leaf to fully open? So more water, maybe a longer steep time, maybe more steepings.
Yeah, more steepings, and just kind of let it hang out.
When I said that the goal is to get the leaf to fully open, you don't necessarily want it to fully open for the first steep. Unless you want a long steep, then over that you want it to be more open.
Generally speaking, by the end of your tea session, so however many brews you're going to do, fully opened leaf is what you're trying to end up with, because once it's fully open, you've reintegrated as much water as that leaf is going to absorb. And as a byproduct of that, you have gotten everything that it's going to give up. Yeah.
So fully opening a leaf is just the smart economic viewpoint of brewing tea, of you've now achieved its full potential.
Yeah.
You've gotten every single flavor out of it. It's used completely.
Yeah. And it with this tea, I'd still brew it. The more fully open one, I'd still brew 2-3 more infusions of that, and I'll be able to pick up on those diminishing returns and be like, okay, we're done here. You have given me all you have, and that's fine. So tea, people got to try to open up. There's your therapy session.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you will join us next month as we talk more about tea.
Yeah.
From a different perspective.
Get into Taiwanese teas.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Good night.